A British judge sat in a London courtroom in 2008 and said something that quietly changed how one of the most famous divorces in history should be understood. He called Paul McCartney honest. He described Heather Mills as inconsistent and less than candid. And just like that, the story seemed settled. But was it really that simple? Heather walked away with £24.3 million, and the headlines focused on the money. The gap between what she asked for and what she got became the story. But years later, when the noise faded and the cameras moved on, Heather started talking again. Not about the settlement. Not about the courtroom. About something else entirely. Something you can't measure in money. And once you hear it, it changes everything. Because what if the real issue wasn't the divorce at all? What if it started long before that? There's a kind of grief that doesn't shout. It doesn't break down in public. It just sits there, quietly, in the background, filling up space until there's no room left for anything new. And when Paul McCartney married Heather in 2002, that kind of grief was already there. Still present. Still heavy. Still unresolved. But how much of it was still shaping his life? Paul was 60 years old. He had lost Linda McCartney just 4 years earlier. She wasn't just his wife. She was his partner in everything. Nearly 3 decades together. Rarely spending a night apart. When she died in 1998, it didn't just hurt. It shattered him. And even he admitted that music couldn't fully carry that loss. So what happens when someone tries to start over before that kind of pain settles? Heather later claimed the grief never really left. It didn't fade. It didn't soften. It just moved into the home they were supposed to share. And that's where things start to feel different. The house in Rye, East Sussex, wasn't just a house. It was a memory. Every wall, every shelf, every corner still carried Linda. Photos everywhere. Personal items untouched. Even plaques with messages like "I love Linda." Imagine walking into that as a new wife. Would it feel like a fresh start? Or like stepping into someone else's life? Heather said it felt like living inside a tribute. Not a home. Not a place that had made space for her. And maybe that's where the cracks began. But then there's a detail that's even harder to ignore. Paul wore Linda's wedding ring after she died. Not unusual. Many people do that. It's a way to hold on. But he didn't take it off until the day before he married Heather. Not when they got engaged. Not when they started planning a future. The day before the wedding. What does that say about where he really was emotionally? To Heather, it wasn't closure. It was proof that nothing had truly closed. That the past wasn't behind him. It was still right there. And that raises a difficult question. Can you build something new if part of you is still somewhere else? Because Linda wasn't just a memory. She was an icon. A public figure. A presence that extended far beyond their private life. Heather wasn't stepping into a quiet space. She was stepping into a world where Linda still existed in photos, in stories, in people's loyalty. How do you compete with that? And according to many accounts, Paul's inner circle didn't make it easier. These were people who had known Linda for decades, who loved her, who saw her as part of their world. Heather, younger and very different, didn't quite fit. The welcome wasn't warm. It never really was. So where did that leave her? An outsider. In her own marriage. In a home that didn't feel like hers. With a past that refused to step aside. And that combination, it's hard to imagine it ending well. But was it doomed from the start? Before Paul, Heather Mills had her own life. A complicated one. She wasn't just a model, as she was often portrayed. She had done humanitarian work in war zones. She had campaigned against landmines. And after losing her leg in a motorcycle accident at 25, she rebuilt her life in a very public way. She became an advocate, a spokesperson, someone who had already faced loss and survived it. So what did she expect from this marriage? Maybe something solid, something shared, something new. But the relationship moved fast. 18 months from meeting to marriage. A child soon after. From the outside, it looked like a love story. But inside, the foundation was already shaking. And then came the fights. One argument during their engagement got so intense that Heather's ring was thrown out of a window. Staff had to search for it outside. That's not a small disagreement. That's something deeper. Something already breaking. And what were they fighting about? Heather's answer never changed. Linda. By the time the divorce reached court in 2008, everything had unraveled. The marriage lasted about 4 years. The legal battle almost 2. And in that courtroom, both sides told very different stories. The judge believed Paul. He didn't fully believe Heather. And that shaped everything that came after. But does a courtroom decide what someone felt inside a marriage? Because legal truth and emotional truth aren't always the same. You can be a poor witness and still have lived something real. And what Heather described wasn't scandalous. It wasn't about cruelty. It was something quieter, and maybe more complicated. She said Paul hadn't finished grieving when he remarried. That his heart was still with Linda. That there was no space left for her to truly belong. And when you look at the house, the ring, the people around him, it's hard not to wonder. Was she wrong? Paul eventually found love again. He married Nancy Chevelle in 2011. Built something new. Something calmer. But even that story connects back to the past. The same place. The same history. Because Paul never really leaves it behind. He carries it with him. And maybe that's the truth at the center of all this. Not that he was cold. Not that he was cruel. But that he loved so deeply once, that moving forward wasn't as simple as it looked. And that someone else stepped into that space before it was ready. So was Heather Mills misunderstood? Or was she pointing to something everyone else chose to ignore? That's the part people still argue about. But one thing is certain. This wasn't just a story about money or divorce. It was a story about timing. About grief. And about what happens when the past doesn't stay in the past.